Kilangla Jamia, who is currently the head of economics department, Nagaland University, is the founding as well as the sitting president of the association. I therefore also very warmly welcome you all to our inaugural lecture on behalf of the president and the executive council of Nagaland Economic Association, and also very gladly extend an invitation to any one of you interested in joining the association for a shared and collaborative scholarly pursuits. Before the speakers speak to us, let me very quickly introduce the speaker, although I cannot be that quick given the elaborate profile of the speaker. Professor Yella J.P. Wouters is currently the chair of the Himalayan Center for Environmental Humanities, Royal Thimphu College, in the beautiful country of Bhutan. He holds an MPhil with distinction in social anthropology from the University of Oxford and a PhD in anthropology from the Northeastern Hill University, Shillong, where he was also a Wenner grantee. Prior to joining Royal Thimphu College, Professor Yella taught at Sikkim Central University, India, and was also a visiting faculty at Eberhard Karls University in Germany under the Excellence Initiative of the German Research Foundation. Professor Yella is the author and editor of 11 books and counting, rapidly counting, I should add. He has authored In the Shadows of Naga Insurgency, published by Oxford University Press, Nagapolis, published by Park Weaver. He co-authored Subaltern Studies 2.0, Being Against the Capital Sin, published by Chicago University Press. He edited Vernacular Politics in Northeast India, Democracy, Ethnicity, and Indigeneity, published by Oxford University Press, and co-edited the Routledge Handbook of Highland Asia, published by Taylor and Francis, as well as the companion to Northeast India, again published by Routledge. So that many only. Above all, from my limited readings of Professor Wouters' works, it appears to me very clearly that Professor's epistemic engagement on anthropological aspects of Nagast and beyond is characterized by wide scholarship as well as incisive academic rigor, and notably to a native Naga researcher, his works are characterized by earnestly careful, sensitivity. His works not only contributes to the body of anthropological literature, but also incisively and insightfully provides and informs institutional understanding of historical and contemporary economic questions. Professor Wouters is therefore, although he is primarily an anthropologist, just the right person to be our inaugural speaker of the lecture series of Nagaland Economic Association. Professor Yella, we are very grateful that you graciously obliged to speak to us. A formal note of gratitude will be delivered by Dr. Empini Kikond. The lecture series convener as well as assistant professor, Department of Economics, Nagaland University, after your talk. As you must have observed from the flyer that we circulated, the upcoming talk in a while also promises to provide, in the language of institutional economics and in an institutional understanding of emerging socio-economic and political developments of critical salience to our state and to our region. Um, so we look forward to that, to deliver a lecture, a distinguished lecture by all accounts, on the topic capitalist desires and ethnic tribal closure in the Highlands of Northeast India. I invite our inaugural speaker, Professor Wouters.
Good morning, everyone. Please allow me to start by thanking the Nagaland Economics Association for very kindly inviting me to be the inaugural speaker for your lecture series. I'm quite amazed that about 70 of you are here, and that too on a Saturday morning. So I do hope I will not disappoint any of you. Before I start, I'm in Bhutan. I'm in Thimphu. Usually, the internet connectivity is quite strong, but there are occasional interruptions. So if at some point I'm not audible or connection is lost, please rest assured that I will do whatever I can to be back as soon as possible. And if I'm not audible, I would be very grateful if the chair might give me a sign. All right. What I propose to do today is to reflect on, I think, one of the main economic issues in Nagaland and in the region at large, which is a multifaceted relationship that includes the state, ecology or the environment, ethnicity, territoriality, and neoliberal capitalism. In particular, I focus on two aspects. One is the social, ecological, and socio-political consequences of its rediscovery as a resource and capitalist frontier. So this talk is therefore not necessarily very modest in its focus. However, I do believe that in its various intersections of these themes, we encounter some of the major problems, predicaments, and processes that characterizes Nagaland in the present as well as in the future, and the region at large. My central contention is to argue how new resource and capital flows in the region lead both to the production of capitalist desires, and I will explain later what I mean by this, and socio-ecological destruction. So the destruction or kind of dishevelment of social mechanisms as well as of the environment itself. And this destruction occurs through the privatization, acquisition, and depletion, mostly by ethnic tribal elites, of communal assets now embedded in newly capitalist relations. So the question here is what happens when capitalism confronts community-owned resources? And secondly, my talk points to the intensification of a politics of exclusive ethno-territorial belonging and rights. The latter comes in the form of volatile social processes of ethnic closure, by which I refer to an increasing preoccupation on part of tribal ethnic communities, local communities, with the protecting, patrolling, and legislation of ethno-territorial rights that are distinctly non-liberal. Put differently, in Nagaland and Highland Northeast India more broadly, neoliberal capitalism confronts non-liberal ethno-territoriality, and new neoliberal connectivities confront ethnic closure. And these tensions, for me, largely capture the contemporary historical moment in this region. Before I go into the specific of my arguments, let me first offer a few reflections. So I'm referring to this region, called of course Northeast India, in a rather unbounded sense, not as something limited to the political boundaries of this region, which coincidentally overlap with India's international boundaries, but are something that overflows, along with its peoples, cultures, and goods, to countries beyond the border. Adjacent to Northeast India in the east lie the highlands of Burma, which geologists, capitalist investors, and local leaders, whether politicians or rebels, all agree are fully stacked with precious mineral resources needed to turn the wheel of extractive neoliberal capitalism. Control to and access over these resources is increasingly the stuff of geopolitics in the wider region. This indeed is the great game of the 21st century, fought especially between India and China, with Burma as the prime battleground. Both from a geo-ecological and capitalist perspective, Highland Northeast India is part of this highland belt of mineral resources that are supposedly waiting to be tapped. There exist very precise estimates about what is to be tapped here. The Northeast Vision 2020 document specified that, and I quote, the northeastern region is endowed with considerable natural resources and hosts 38% of the country's river waters, 20% of hydrocarbon, which is oil and gas potential, large quantities of low ash coal resources, limestone and dolomite deposits and other minerals, unquote. The same report, and this is important, lamented how these resources still mostly remain untapped, primarily because of the large investments that are required and environmental regulations. Here, in this particular report, environmental regulations are highlighted as an impediment to capitalist expansion. And I think this is an important theme we need to think about more in thinking about the future of Nagaland and the region at large. Okay, the second remark is that I emphasize rediscovery of Highland Northeast India in terms of resources rather than discovery. This is to highlight this region's long-standing frontier status as one of permanent prospect that emerged during the colonial era. This view largely disappeared amid the political upheaval that followed India's independence and now has re-emerged over the past few decades following the transformation of most armed conflicts into a contentious politics and economics of ceasefires, suspension of operation agreements, and stalled and incomplete political negotiations. Now, popular and also academic imaginings of pre-colonial Highland Northeast India as remote and isolated are in fact not very accurate. They mistakenly project the colonial effect of insulating and cordoning off the highlands into a deeper history. In fact, prior to the colonial annexation and the devastating First Anglo-Burmese War, parts of these highlands were also the sources and corridors for substantial overland trade in mineral wealth and commercial articles between Tibet, southern China, Burma, and Bengal. At first, the British sought to tap into these trade networks and promote the further capitalist integration of the highlands. It was only after this failed, mostly due to the fierce resistance by the Naga and other communities, that the colonial government shifted its focus to tea cultivation in the plains and lower foothills and adapted a series of policy, most notably the Inner Line, that progressively sequestered the highlands, the latter becoming an insulated frontier of ungoverned, virtually autonomous tribes. Perhaps as a small digression here, most of the literature argues that tea plantations were the first kind of colonial focus in the region. But at that moment, it was the second best option. The British first wanted to tap into pre-existing capitalist or rather trade and commercial networks that existed in the hills. This dismayed early corporations and investors in the region, who sought access to timber, coal, and other mineral resources. So corporations felt very resentful against the presence of the Inner Line. However, one way of reading capitalism's early career in the highlands is by focusing on how capitalist investments and relations continuously sought to advance beyond the Inner Line and into the unadministrated frontier in pursuit of resources and profit. These emergent capitalist relations, in which highlanders themselves were often active, purposeful agents, bypassed the colonial state, whose officers grew increasingly disgruntled by their inability to control and draw revenues from resource expropriation and trade in the ungoverned frontier. Ultimately, it was the colonial state's desire to seize definite control over the Naga Hills and its natural resources that constituted one of the prime motivations for the gradual and haphazard administrative incorporation of the Highland frontier. The decades of insurgency and counterinsurgency that followed India's independence in wide swaths of Northeast India resulted, on the one hand, in the complete state enclosures of the Highlands, and on the other, in a relative stalling of capitalist integration. The final remark, before I go into the main body of my talk today, is related to the concept of ethno-territoriality, which I included in my title. This is not my term. It's a term that was coined by the political scientist Sanjeev Barua. The new neoliberal capitalist orientation of the Indian state now confront pre-existing constitutionally enshrined ethnic tribal rights over land and resources, the history of which rake back to colonial times. Now, ethno-territoriality refers to a distinctly non-liberal and constitutionally enshrined regime of governance that provides substantial political autonomy and exclusive, near inalienable rights over land and resources to selected ethnic tribal communities in territories with which they are primarily associated. To put this perhaps in more simple terms, ethno-territoriality refers to the sense of community and the various kind of amendments and schedules that have been enacted for Nagaland and other countries, and that are now being confronted by capitalist advance. So for a specific Nagaland question, here the debate would be what happens when capitalism and Article 371A, when they meet? What comes out of this tension? I have a part here about the fifth and the sixth schedule, which I think I will not really go into today, except for saying that in offering territorialized regimes of positive discrimination and rights, in which Nagaland, but also other states have specific amendments, Highland Northeast India became a place of governmental exception. Of course, there also exist policies for tribal communities in central India, as well as for OBC, SC, and so on. But the difference is that these regulations are not related to territory. Whereas in Northeast India, the amendments and the special kind of schemes and regulations are tied down to specific territory. And this makes Northeast India an exception. I now come to the main part of my talk. For all the tourism advertisements and popular images that present Highland Northeast India, Nagaland included, as nature's bounty and lure visitors both national and international with promises of pristine pine forest, sacred bamboo groves, blue rivers and lush valleys, it is increasingly also possible to think of Nagaland and other parts of the region as an ecological disaster zone. For instance, visit the once densely forested Shillong Peak in Meghalaya, known as the natural guardian of Khasi land. Today you'll find it hugely denuded, the result of a Khasi Siem, or chief, having struck a lucrative deal with a non-tribal contractor for its lease and logging, and for which he circumvented Khasi customary law, as the peak was actually meant to be community-owned. Or walk across the degraded agricultural lands of the Gentia Hills, also in Meghalaya, as the result of rudimentary red hole mining carried out by non-tribal labor migrants employed by tribal landowners. A dwindling number of Gentias still reside there, having instead moved to large mansions in urban centers like Jowai and Shillong, except for the poor and marginalized sections of the Gentia, for whom the coal boom and coal mafia meant dispossession and alienation. Meanwhile, post-ceasefire Nagaland witnessed the intensification of timber and coal extraction, vested in informal networks that link Naga landowners with non-tribal contractors and companies in the Assam plains, and that produce cash-rich Naga individuals and ancestral land rendered bare, visible subsidence and landslides, coal seam fires and air pollution, poisoned streams and dying rivers. These are just a few examples of a wider unfolding of eco-destructive commoditization of natural resources, private accumulation and community alienation and despoliation, dispossession and ruin internal, right, to ethnic tribal communities. At face value, the apparent local friction generated by capitalist integration evidences neoliberal capitalism's known capacity for destruction of nature and degradation of human lives. What, however, needs theorizing in the context of Nagaland and Northeast India is its unfolding in a space where alternative visions of governance, development, and resource management elevate and valorize the customary authority, customary law, and jurisdiction, and communal land allocation. Put simply, no one, not a coercive state, external development agencies, or powerful corporations can force, legally speaking, Nagas or Khasis or Mizos or any other highland community protected by constitutional provisions to transform their ancestral lands into extractive zones, to align their natural resources with the market, and in this process to circumvent customary regimes characteristic only of themselves. Highlanders' apparent capitalist enthusiasm, even at tragic cost, therefore prompts one of the most challenging and provocative questions coined by the anthropologist Anat Singh. And her question is the following: how do ordinary people get involved in destroying their environment, even their own home places? Unquote. I propose this question and its consequences through two analytics. The first is desire, in the sense of capitalist desires. Talking about desires in the context of Nagaland and Northeast India amounts to an analytical term because it complicates a long-standing scholarly preoccupation with highland rebellion and revolt, state evasion, and supposedly anarchic solidarity through foregrounding the contemporary aspirations and desires of those located at the margins of the nation-state. Put simply, scholarship on the region has often been about resistance and rebellion. But here, we are talking about something else. We are talking about desire, about aspirations. After long and violent decades of ethno-national rebellion and resistance of varied kinds that followed India's independence, most Highlanders in Northeast India today live post-rebellious lives, in the sense that they have resigned themselves, even somewhat half-heartedly, to the spatial and political reality of India and their place within it. Most of them no longer demand the rolling back of the Indian state and market structures, but actively desire a state and capitalist community sociality, although so, and this is crucial, on terms of ethno-territorial exception. I'm not suggesting that resistance and desire are complete opposite. They can variously intersect and coexist. But I do suggest that we have to supplement existing scholarship with notions of contemporary aspirations and desires. Now, focusing on emergent capitalist desires, so this means communities and individuals in Nagaland and elsewhere having the active aspiration and desire to turn their natural resources into a commodity and to earn a good life out of that, right? I make three interlocking arguments in relation to the notion of capitalist desires. And I'm here not saying, of course, that capitalist desire is a good thing. Rather, the tone of my paper is perhaps in a different direction. My first remark is that this desire to extract is not wholly agental. It's not only about choice. Marx had argued very long ago, and I paraphrase him here, that people make their own decisions and create history, but they do so under constraints of external forces and relations that condition their wills and desires. For this reason, desire is perhaps best approached in the sense used by Deleuze and Guattari as a creative and positive force that is both produced by and productive of wider social and political economic context. More pointedly, I argue that what locally drives resource extraction alludes to what the anthropologist Holly Hay, in a very different context, calls a shared delirium. That is a set of contradictory, irrational orientations that nevertheless produce their own coherence and rationality. Delirium in this context is invoked to refer to a change in collective social and mental condition, a collective confusion, disorientation, in which rationality and irrationality intersect and converge. Let me illustrate this. Now, many Nagas often spoke to me about the ecological degradation of their ancestral and communal lands and voiced concerns about the reproduction of their community. Many simultaneously saw the cutting of their forest, the tapping of their rivers, and the excavation and emptying of their lands as enticing fields of possibility and prospect. What they desired was not limited to individual material gain, but also and significantly reflective of a widespread aspiration and hope to escape agriculture and marginality, to live not traditional but cosmopolitan lives, and to secure a comfortable future for their children. It was in pursuit of these ends that linking their natural resources to the capitalist market seemed the rational thing to do, even at a contradictory cost of environmental destruction and an experienced corrosion of community. So here we see the delirium emerging. On the one hand, it seemed the rational thing to do to excavate mineral resources from ancestral land. On the other hand, this creates a problem for future generations. And this is precisely the contradiction between rationality and irrationality. Again, others I spoke to during my fieldwork saw it as a necessary evil. Amid the rapidly changing demands, expectations, and cost of contemporary life, indulging in resource extraction seemed to them the sole option left. Perhaps I should introduce this with a small vignette from my fieldwork. Meet Vitso. He hails from Nagaland, is in his mid-40s, a father of three, and without formal employment. I first met him in Kohima, where I interviewed him on multiple occasions. At the time, he had recently convinced the customary authority vested in the village council of a nearby village to lease him a hillock, including permission for its logging. The land was community-owned and presided over by the council. Its members, however, had agreed to Vitso's monetary offer, which also included him hosting a communal feast. There are few people in that village with the know-how and connections to do timber business, yet they don't want to be left out of the profit it brings. Vitso explained the council's decision to grant him the land lease. For the actual logging, he employed several villagers and paid them a substantial daily wage. The amount he spent, however, remained significantly less than the price he had agreed for the timber with a non-Naga contractor from the plains. Vitso was conscious about the environmental destruction he was causing, and which bothered him. But then it was his dream to send his three children to a good college in one of India's metropolitan cities. He wanted to provide them with a kind of education, and with that, the future prospects his own parents had been unable to offer him, and because of which, Vitso reasoned, he had not been able to secure formal employment. He did not want his children to suffer the same fate. To send his children to a good college outside the state was expensive, however. The stripping bare of a hilltop now offered him the money he needed. Motivations like Vitso's are common across Nagaland and illustrate the shared delirium of desires that underlies resource extraction, in the sense that indulging in it generates its own rationalities, for instance, to finance higher education for one's children, even when people engaged in it may not actually believe in them. For instance, Vitso's worry about him destroying the environment. My second point. While capitalist desires are now widespread in Nagaland and elsewhere, in actual practice, the cultivation of capitalist relations remains a highly uneven and fragmentary process. It requires, after all, not just land, but also know-how and connections, as the case of Vitso 2 illustrates. As such, emergent capitalist relations play into pre-existing inequalities and social hierarchies. It are particularly elite sections of Naga and other communities who insert themselves centrally in new capitalist networks. They extract and transact natural resources, and in doing so, actively evade state intervention and control. By indeed progressively privatizing earlier communal assets for purposes of accepting, commoditizing, and exploiting, these ethnic tribal elites appear distinctly neoliberal inspired. In its most exploitative form, Naga and other elites, by one or another means, appropriate and dominate capitalist networks and exploit new opportunities to enrich themselves to the disadvantage and dispossession of less privileged sections within their own community. So we see here that the inequality is growing not between Naga communities and non-Naga communities, but internal to Naga communities. And this is perhaps quite a new development. Of course, not that earlier Naga communities in the region followed egalitarian traditions. Social hierarchies existed, mattered, and allocated prominence and power to a host of social personas, including Naga chiefs and councillors, wealthy feast givers, clan elders, and warriors. They, however, by and large, fulfilled a communal purpose within the wider political, economic, and social geography of the past. For instance, through a prestige economy, through protection, through communal feasting, and the ritual irrigation and regeneration of social life. Today's elites are experienced to be distinctive, however. Under the current neoliberal conditions, Naga and other elites seem to be progressively evacuating themselves from traditional institutions and the wider moral economy of the past. This reflects itself in a widely held grievance, palpably amongst Nagas across the region, as well as other communities, that those at the top of the social hierarchy are decreasingly servicing the wider community and progressively becoming predatory on it. And I think this is one of the major transformations that we see in the region today. In the interest of time, I think I skip a few parts. This leads us to the final argument here, which is that state provisions, Article 371A and others, for autonomy and the precedence of customary laws are often used by ethnic tribal elites to keep the state out and indulge in destructive resource extraction. For instance, while Article 371A to the Constitution guarantees Nagaland Naga's exclusive ownership and control over its natural resources, this act, and I think this is crucial, is not generally invoked against extractive regimes. So it is not that people invoke Article 371A to say that we should not have coal or timber or gas extracted from the land. It's not used like that. Rather, it has been appropriated by Naga stakeholders to make competing claims about their customary rights, which they invoke to resist the state's attempt to seize control over natural resources. So Article 371A has become part of a tussle between Nagaland state, Nagaland communities and individuals, not about whether resource extraction should take place. Apparently everyone agrees that it should, but the question, the tussle is really who has the right to do it and who has the right to profit from it. So what we see here is the invocation of custom to settle local disputes about who exactly has access to land and its resources and the right to extract them. A defining feature of the contemporary political life in the region is centered on an often volatile standoff between local communities and state governments over access and control over natural resources. Akin to its colonial predecessor, local state governments resent their inability to extract resources and generate revenues from it. We often hear this from the Nagaland state government, for instance. As part of this tussle, recent years saw persistent attempts by state governments to capture control or regulate resource extraction, including largely unsuccessful bans on coal extraction. In Nagaland, this tension further reveals itself in a protected impasse between the state-owned Nagaland Mineral Development Corporation and Naga landowners over rights and revenues with regard to untapped oil reserves. The state government's desire to drill oil is part of a longer and complex history locally that saw the central government-owned Oil and Natural Gas Corporation, ONGC, threatened and extorted away from Nagaland in the 1980s by the NSCN. That aspired, of course, Naga independence and for which oil and other Naga natural resources were seen as exclusive and long-term political dividend. Okay. I now turn to the second part of my talk, which will be quite shorter. And this is the focus on ethno-territorial closure. And remember here that the overall argument is that capitalist desires and ethno-territorial closure are closely interlinked. Claims and control over nature can be a moving spirit of ethnic belonging and nationalism, so also in Northeast India, where ethno-national uprisings, the Naga movement prime among them, saw in the mineral wealth a viable future as independent ethnic polities. For Fiso, it was Naga's natural resources that explained why, quote, India has an eye on our land, unquote. What further worried Fiso was the potential influx of non-tribal, non-local migrant laborers to extract these resources and then gradually dislodging Naga demography, economy, and culture. It was this double existential threat of the Indian state intending, in Fiso's phrasing, quote, to dump her excess population in Nagaland, as well as exploit the rich natural resources in our territory, unquote, that turned into a potent political rallying point. This discourse by Fiso, but later also of the Mizo insurgent leader and later Chief Minister Laldenga and other ethnic leaders in the Highlands, did of course not imply that land is to be preserved internally, but that it is to be protected from encroachment from a quote invading / colonizing unquote post-colonial state and its subjects. The sixth schedule and the ethnic homeland model largely, as noted, ensured the continued community ownership of land and resources. These provisions did not, in the long run, prevent large number of, often illegal, non-tribal migrants from climbing the hills, however. Their arrival is spurred or prompted by the neoliberal opening of the highland periphery for capitalist flows and financing, accelerating further in recent years through the Look Now Act East policy project that promotes connectivity infrastructure, the mobility of people and labor, and market integration, standardization, and homogenization. In this unfolding context, in which flows of capital and labor are making their way into Nagaland and adjoining areas, certain ambiguous energies are released by the influx in still growing numbers of non-tribal, non-local migrants who follow the trail of capital into what are purportedly exclusive ethno-territorial homelands. The result, for one thing, is an intensification of the politics of belonging, tied to demands for exclusive tribal and territorial rights that find expression in volatile discourses and urgent summons to defend tribal identity and lands against threatening hordes of immigrants. I concentrate here on a certain anxiety that emerges from an existential fear that the accelerated neoliberal opening of Nagaland and other highlands, and relatedly the inflow of migrants, will culminate into ethnic emasculation or tribal emasculation and erasure through the corrosion of political autonomy and exclusive ethno-territorial rights and belonging. As it is, there is a strong argument to be made that the neoliberal opening of the highlands instigates an apparent contradictory movement, a desire that is for non-liberal tribal ethnic closure. This social process reveals itself in an increasing local preoccupation with territorial and cultural policing, new legislation on ethnic belonging, and the occasional communal violence and quote-unquote justice, all in the name of preserving or restoring ethnic tribal sovereignty, control, and wholeness in the resource and capitalist frontier. Examples of this process are many, and I give you three brief ones. First, the proposed Khasi Lineage Act, tabled by the Khasi Hills Autonomous District Councils, that would cause Khasi women to lose their right to land, property, and clan names if they marry a non-Khasi, as would the progeny of these unions. What prompts this attempted legal closure of what constitutes Khasi-ness is a reinvigorated nervousness of creeping ethnic impurity due to the rising instances of inter-ethnic marriages, and relatedly, the widely held suspicion that non-Khasi men marry Khasi women merely as a ploy to gain access to the community's land and mineral wealth. It is a similar impulse of keeping ethnic outsiders away and control over natural resources in that explains societal opposition in Meghalaya against large-scale neo-developmentalist projects, including uranium mining. Opposition, this is, I think, an important point, is not primarily because of very real environmental concerns, but on the grounds that these projects will attract laborers from Bangladesh and other parts of India, so threatening the survival of the Khasi ethnic tribal community. The second example pertains agitated and aggressive demands for the reimposition and fresh drawing of inner lines. In its colonial imposition, the inner line walked actually to the disadvantage of highland communities, as it isolated them in unprecedented ways. Oftentimes in scholarship, we see arguments that the inner line was meant to benefit Nagas and other communities, but that was never really the intention of the colonial administrators. They wanted to keep the hill people away from the plains, rather necessarily than the other way around of trying to keep the plains people out of the hills. In the contemporary moment, however, ethnic tribal communities have resorted to their agency and political imagination to appropriate the inner line as a legislative shield to prevent and patrol the arrival of non-tribal immigrant settlers. Thus, while the Indian government is resorting to neoliberal developmentalism and massive connectivity infrastructure projects to link markets, commerce, and peoples, ethnic tribal communities have taken to the inner line regimes afresh to limit and control the entry of non-local people into their ancestral lands. For instance, within a month after Arunachal Pradesh was finally connected to India's vast railway network in 2015, train services had to be suspended after local fears and protests that railway connectivity would allow non-locals to bypass the inner line regime and so threaten indigenous identities. This renewed focus on inner lines implies the frontierization of the highlands as colonial characteristics of identifying, governing, and the setting apart of tribes and territories reinvent himself. Different this time, however, is that inner lines are no longer an imposition. I think this is again a point of note, but have become an object of political desire, to the extent that communities in Meghalaya and Manipur have successfully agitated for its implementation, while it is now also locally demanded in parts of Assam. Remarkable here is that Manipur and Assam were never subject to an inner line during the colonial era in the first place. So the overall paradox here is that while the Act Look East policy is trying to open transnational connections, fresh demands and impositions of inner line is blocking intrastate movements. The third example consists of an emergent volatile discourse against ethnic outsiders in Nagaland, but not only here, also in other states. And I'm almost coming to the end of my talk. And its manifestation in enumeration and citizenship determination drives, quit notices, and occasional violence directed against non-local migrant workers. The past couple of decades witnessed commercial and capitalist expansion in Nagaland, and with that, the influx of non-tribal migrant laborers. Many of these immigrants are thought to hail from Bangladesh, having crossed to India illegally. While these immigrants have long been a social familiarity in Nagaland, the relation between Naga host and migrant settlers never really transcended the fear that his distinct features, culture, and religion potentially turns him into a rival an enemy in a different situation and time. Quote, it may not be too long before somebody with the power of numbers demands a union territorial status in Dimapur. Its market areas already look like a mini Bangladesh, albeit more lucrative, an editorial cautioned a few years ago. Amid this fear of Naga's emasculation within their own state, what has emerged ever more forcefully in recent years has been a pro-Naga discourse of ethnic and territorial control that glared with apprehension at a local economy that now largely functioned on immigrant labor. In 2015, the Naga Student Federation stepped up its earlier statewide campaign to, quote, flush out, unquote, Bangladesh immigrants. Quote, immigration from Bangladesh has become a serious threat to Naga society, the NSF president asserted. A few years earlier in Mokokchung town, a new organization emerged that called itself Survival Nagaland and set itself the task of, quote, cleansing the town of illegal Bangladeshis. Quit notices were served and retribution promised to those who defied them, causing about 3,000 Muslim businessmen, traders, and laborers to flee Mokokchung. In other places, municipal and village councils embarked on so-called enumeration drives to identify the names and addresses of Bangladeshi immigrants residing within their territorial jurisdiction. If this may seem relatively innocuous, the pages of history reveal how identification and documentation have often led to actual, often violent removal of those thus identified from the body politic. It is in the above examples, the criminalizing of inter-ethnic marriages in Meghalaya, the resurgence of the inner line in Meghalaya, Manipur, and parts of Assam, and the expelling or the threat thereof of ethnic others in Nagaland, that the contemporary compulsions and carryovers of capitalist expansion, especially in the migrant labor streams they provoke, clash with a surge of ethno-territorial assertion in the form of volatile social processes of ethnic closure. The conclusion. So this talk engaged the dialectical kind of relations between new neoliberal conditions and connectivities, territoriality and ethnicity in Nagaland and Highland Northeast India's resource and capitalist frontier. If we put together the various observations and arguments discussed above, what reveals itself in this connection is the connection, correlation, and convergence between resource and capitalist flows and two complex, apparently contradictory social processes. On the one hand, there is the production of capitalist desires that lead to the expropriation of earlier customary guarantees that, among others, reveals itself as regimes of accumulation, dispossession, and alienation internal to Naga and other communities. At play here is a shared delirium, a widely shared irrationality of eco-destructive resource extraction that is nevertheless vested in its own rationalities of it answering to contemporary aspirations and desires of those long marginalized. The question for the long future here is whether these regimes of socio-ecologically corrosive resource extraction will be destroying, sustaining, or reinventing Naga and other ethnic tribal communities. On the other, the increasing presence of non-tribal labor migrants drawn by neoliberal conditions animate an ostensibly opposite, distinctly non-liberal political, material, and social impulse, with ethnic tribal communities seeking to close their territorial and ethnic ranks. What prompts this volatile social process is a rising existential anxiety about the possible convertibility of constitutional provisions and rights into a neoliberal streamlining and the erasure of difference in the Highlands. How this tension will unfold over the long run is still very much in question, but the general point of which is that ethnic tribal communities in Highland Northeast India, while desiring incorporation in new neoliberal capitalist regimes, nevertheless seek to hold a measure of control on the terms of which neoliberal capitalism is engaged. I thank you for your attention.
That was a fascinating talk, Professor. Thank you so much for your, as you mentioned, truly multifaceted talk on emerging developments in Naga society as well as societies in Northeast India, informed by historical illustrations, informed by contemporary events, as well as informed by very powerful to me theoretical constructs, including ethno-territoriality, capitalist desires, uh, and so on. And in the process of your talk, notably, you also demonstrated to the economists in attendance the employment of ethnography in answering economic questions. I think that is a very powerful takeaway to all the economists in attendance. With your permission, we shall now take questions. Um, the extent of the Q&A session will depend on the time we have. Um, to whosoever thinking of asking questions, please do keep your questions brief. And as chair, allow me to have the privilege of asking the question first. The problems that you presented, Professor, can be understood as one of a conflict between capitalist institutions driven by capitalist desires and communitarian institutions, sometimes driven by ethno-territorial assertions. The said conflict engenders adverse socio-ecological consequences, including, as you mentioned, consequences of intergenerational nature. Uh, since I am a native, from Nagaland, from Northeast, it is of interest to me if you can throw some light as to how to resolve the conflict that you mentioned, the contradictions that you mentioned, so as to engender or contribute towards an inclusive societal progress.
Thank you. I think your question directly goes to the very heart of the matter. And I think the main kind of tussle that we see today is the confrontation between neoliberal capitalism and corporations with community, customs, and chiefs. And I think this is the main kind of conversation that has been taking place for some time now and will continue to take place in the near kind of future. And I think the outcome of this conversation is going to be at the heart of the future of Naga inhabited areas and Northeast India more broadly. And really, the outcome of this conversation will, to a very large degree, I think, shape the economic scenario as well as the social and political scenario of the Naga areas. I'm not sure whether it is. I don't think it's on me to necessarily suggest how this can be done, except to note that this is probably the most important conversation that is happening in the region today, the most consequential for sure.
Thank you. The floor is open for questions. If you do not want to verbally ask the questions, you may type your questions on the chat box, and I will read it out for Professor to answer. Any questions? Let me check the chat box. Any questions?
Um, I think the participants are framing their question. Meanwhile, maybe I will also take the advantage as the convener for this talk series. Um, it may not sound like a question, but it is just a deliberation that I want to have with you. Throughout your talk, I was just imagining about the social cohesion, how it is leading to the growth of elite desire, or so we call it as a capitalist desire, in the borderland or in the region of Nagaland. I'm sure you must be aware about the illegal coal mining that is widely happening in the districts, in some of the districts in Nagaland. And the recently incident that has happened in the district of Woka, in the region of Pandari district, that in those Bell, which is bordering Assam, where huge illegal mining is it's been there since the generational problem that is. But what I also, that was also part of my field work during my PhD time, and somehow we align in this area. I was just thinking through the process of the government intervention and policy from the state government in this aspect, where uh, people, the landowners over there, they feel whatever is on top of the land and whatever is inside the land, it's their property. They are ignorant about the constitutional and rules and regulations with regards to the natural resources, the tribals particularly. While some of the elites, the tribal elites in that region, has started illegal mining, and massive environmental destruction has happened in that region, which is an outcome of the social cohesion, the local, when I say the local social cohesion, that has led to the growth of this capitalist elite in that region, and which has also led to the penetration of Bangladeshi migrant, because the mine workers are, of course, not the locals over there. Those the locals cannot do that kind of menial job, and also that has also led to in those pockets of the villages where these massive illegal minings are happening, the villagers has almost given up farming, which is their livelihood, and they are sustaining with the meager compensation, or the meager amount that they are receiving from the coal mining done by those capitalist elites. And these capitalist elites are also, most of them are the permit holders are the locals. Now with the new rule, as we see, if I'm from the Lotha region, I'm a Lotha girl, so I, in the Wokha district, only a Lotha community can hold the coal mining permit. If it is in the Ao region in Mokokchung, only an Ao can hold the permit. So I hold the permit, but I don't do the mining. I outsource it to some capitalists in the who are non-Naga, to penetrate in the Naga land, and I'll also extract all the natural resources, where the laborers, the miners, the extortion, everything is an outsider, but I am making the pathway for them, I as a local, right? So all this has led to an entire massive degeneration of the occupational hazard, environmental hazards, which the locals are unaware about, the sustainability in the future. So how government is aware about it, how the Nagaland government, as a social anthropologist or as an economist, can penetrate and restructure this entire system, or at least to curtail or contain what is happening in those pockets of the regions, which is now a bigger, larger concern for the future generation. It is, I'm sure you are expert in this. I'm not an expert in the environmental or in the social anthropological aspects. I'm an economist, but if you see, that's a huge worry for the future generation in terms of sustainability of not only the sustainability of livelihood, but also of the ecological question. It is a very big concern for the Naga Hills.
I see in your in the examples you offered, I see in them more or less illustrations of the main tensions I've tried to accentuate in my talk. On the one hand, we see perhaps Naga farmers who suddenly see an opportunity to increase their economic status And they may also do that for their family, for the children, for the future generation. And from that perspective, that's the rational thing to do. On the other hand, right, it comes at an environmental cost, and this environmental cost will be felt for generations, thereby making it an irrational thing to do. So I think here the delirium is very much at play, in which rational and irrational decisions are kind of playing into one another. Your narrative also indicates this tussle about 371A. Initially, 371A was to safeguard Nagaland and resources internally. But what it has come down to, increasingly so, is a competition or a conflict within Nagaland about who has the right to extract natural resources. Should it be the state? The state argues yes. Should it be the community? The community argues yes. Should it be individual landowners? Individual landowners say yes, it should be us, right? And this debate is really not settled, right? And the third part is that we see is that what is emerging is a new ethnic tribal elite. And of course, Dolly Kikon has done a very good work on this in her book, Living with Oil and Coal, on all of these debates as well.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Rajesh, you have a question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Tumne. Is I'm audible?
Yes, you are. Please go ahead.
So, actually, the talk was very interesting. Meantime, actually, there was some internet connectivity issue, so that's why I could not able to if the doctor can explain it. Could you please elaborate that role that ethnic tribal identity in the shaping of this socio-political landscape when it comes to the Nagaland Highlands, and how it intersects with the force of the neoliberal capitalism?
Rajesh, your voice is
Yeah.
breaking. We can't hear you clearly. Can you kindly type your question on the chat box?
Okay, is my voice now fine?
Now it seems to be fine.
Okay, so my question was that, it was slightly I was that because of the internet connection, I could not hear that. How that if the author can elaborate the role of authentic tribal identity when it comes to the socio-political landscape of the Naga Highlands, and how he intersect with the focus of the neoliberal capitalism.
Okay, I'm not sure whether I fully understood your question, um, but I think the contention is that there is a conversation or a confrontation between capitalist institutions, right, to talk in economic terms, and as the chair has rightly put it, communitarian institutions at the moment, including customs and communities and chiefs, and that conversation is leading to a rethinking about identity, but it's especially leading to communities closing their ranks. On the one hand, they require non-tribal corporations and laborers, right? On the other hand, there is this fear that this will lead to an emasculation and erasure of Naga ethnic tribal sovereignty. So I think here neoliberal kind of capitalist impulses and ethno-territorial impulses are also in this tension. And I hope it was fairly obvious from the little talk that I gave today that I'm trying to think through all these conversations and tensions that are kind of unfolding. And I think that in this unfolding, what will emerge is going to be quite crucial for the immediate and longer term future of the region.
maybe a final question. Any question from anybody? If there are no questions, it was a really fascinating talk, a lot to think about. Maybe the participants are still trying to wrap around, the talk. You gave us a lot to think about, Professor. So, anyway, I will now request Dr. Rampini Kikont for the note of gratitude.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chair. I would like to take this time on the behalf of Nagaland Economic Association and also the Department of Economics, Nagaland University, and also all the participants who have joined us today. Would like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to our lecture series team member, first of all, and also the scholars who have sincerely worked at the back end to make this session successful. And of course, to our esteemed speaker today, Dr. Wouters, who is an associate professor at the Royal Thimphu College. Thank you so much, sir, for gracing our first NIA inaugural session and sharing your valuable insights on the very important, sensitive, and of course, a pertinent issue on the rise of capitalist desire and ethnic tribal customary laws in the Northeast India. Sir, it has been an enlightening and a very enriching session. I have a lot of follow-up, maybe a discussion with you, but I was thinking that let me not steal the time and give chance to the participants, but maybe, of course, there is always the next time for us. We thank you, and I want to express our deep appreciation for the time and the effort that you have put and invested in preparing this this session, and also delivering a very, very engaging and thought-processing lecture with us. Your expertise and knowledge in this field have, of course, undoubtedly left a very lasting impact on all of us. Thank you so much, sir, and thank you for your time. Thank you to all the participants also over here.
Thank you, Dr. Rampini. Thank you once again, Professor. It was a great pleasure listening to you. And to all the participants who joined us, thank you so much. Until the next lecture, take care, and we will all see you again.
Thank you. Thank you to you as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you.